Welcome to Wheelock's Latin, chapter 23. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at verbals and more specifically, participles. Now, let's talk about verbals. What exactly is a verbal? Well, nota bene, verbals are verbs that are used as adjectives or nouns. There are three different kinds of verbals, one of which we've already run into, infinitives. These are verbs that are used as nouns specifically. Participles, which is the subject of this chapter, are verbs that are used as adjectives. And then finally, another verbal that we'll encounter a little bit later on in Wheelock's is the gerund. Gerunds are verbs that are ending in ing and used as nouns. Now, I do want to mention that some participles will also end in ing, but not every form of a participle ends in an ing. But gerunds will always have an ing ending, and they're used as nouns as opposed to participles, which are verbs being used as adjectives. Let's look at a few English examples that'll help us illustrate this. So here is an example of an infinitive. To err is human. To err is an infinitive, and it's being used as a subject. So this is a use of the infinitive as a noun. It is the subject of the linking verb is, and human is the predicate nominative. To err is human. Well, here's an example of an English participle, a verb being used as an adjective. The walking man fell into the sea. Here we have the word man is our subject. Fell is our verb. Into the sea, of course, is a prepositional phrase. And the word walking, like I am walking, that's a verb, but here it's not being used as the verb. The verb is fell. Here this is the word walking being used as an adjective to modify the word man. Which man fell into the sea? The one who was walking. The walking man fell into the sea. Here's an example of a gerund. Again, we'll be studying this a few chapters from now, but just so that we can say we've covered it here and introduced the concept. Singing is fun. Singing is a verb, but it's not being used as a verb. Here, the verb in this sentence is a linking verb, is. Singing is fun. Here, singing, an ing verb, being used as a noun. It's the subject of is. So singing is fun. So these are three different kinds of verbals. Well, chapter 23, we're going to focus in on participles. Let's look at a definition of participles. The word participle actually comes from a combination of two Latin words, pars and capere. Pars, of course, means part, and capere means to take or to capture. And so literally the word participle means to take or to take part or share in something. Specifically, these are verbs that function as adjectives, and they share characteristics of both verbs and adjectives. So think of participles as kind of mutant verbs. They look like verbs in many ways, but they don't function as verbs. They function as either nouns or as adjectives. And we're focusing on participles, so they function as adjectives. Let's look again back at that English example I gave you just a minute ago. The man fell into the sea. The walking man fell into the sea. So here again is the word man is subject, fell, verb, into the sea, a prepositional phrase. The word walking, again, is a participle. It's a verb functioning as an adjective, modifying the subject, man. Now, it's often helpful to diagram sentences to sort of see how they function. Sometimes it illustrates function and purpose in the sentence and helps give visual evidence to what we're talking about here. So here we have the man fell, there's our subject and verb, into the sea, prepositional phrase, and there's the word walking. Notice it's under the word man. This is an adjective, this is where an adjective would go. It goes under the line, under the word it modifies. Notice it is a curved line, indicating it's not just a regular adjective, like the word the, a direct article, the, is just on a slanted straight line. Here, walking is on a curved line, indicating it is a participle. The walking man fell into the sea. Now, I want to say that in Latin, the Romans made great use of participles. So learning participles is incredibly important. But note that when we translate them into English, it just sounds awkward to say the walking man fell into the sea. In English, we might say something like the man who was walking fell into the sea. We'll get into translation of participles here in a few minutes, but I want you to understand that you have to kind of massage or nuance the translation to make it sound less wooden in English, in the receptor language. So for right now, let's look at how we form participles. Here we go. Oh, before we look at forming, let's be a little bit more clear on how these words, how they look. Participles are part verb and part adjective, as I mentioned a minute ago. They have characteristics of both verbs and adjectives. Let me show you what that looks like. The verb characteristics is going to come from the base of the participle. In other words, the front end of the participle is going to come directly from a verb, and it's going to look like a verb. It's going to have voice and tense. It's going to have those characteristics. It's going to have conjugation, so you should be able to look at the connecting vowel and determine if it's a first conjugation, second, third, fourth, or third IO. Those will be evident, so those will be important that if you've already learned those connecting vowels and how they modify and how they shift as you conjugate a verb, this is going to be important because you're going to see this play out in the participial forms of these verbs. And finally, we're going to see the characteristic of expectancy in these participles. They're going to take direct objects, be part of prepositional phrases, etc. And then finally, here's the adjective characteristics. This is going to be the ending of the participle. The front part is the verb. That's the base of the participle. But we're going to have endings of participles that are going to be characteristics of adjectives. They're going to have case, number, and gender. And of course, because adjectives have to agree with a noun in case, number, and gender, these participles will also agree in case, number, and gender with the nouns that they modify. All right, so let's look at the different tenses that we have for Latin participles. English has several forms that Latin is missing. In Latin, we have 4 of the tenses represented. We have the present active participle. We have the future active participle. We have the perfect passive participle, and we have the future passive participle. Let's see how these different tenses are formed. Well, first, in the present active, we're going to use the present stem. The present stem plus each of these participles are going to have a connecting consonant or connecting consonant and vowel that are going to help join the participle verb base plus the adjective endings. So here we have in the present, nt, present, we have an ns in one form, and then the rest of them will be nt. We'll see what that looks like in a minute. But basically, if you see an nt on the end of a verb, then you know, or in the middle of a verb, I should say, then you know you have a participle in the present active. And then this connecting vowel, connecting consonants will be joining the base to third declension I stem endings. So present stem plus an ns or nt plus third declension I stem endings. We'll look at the forms in a minute. It'll all become clear as mud, hopefully. Much clearer, hopefully. Now, the second tense we will have in Latin participles is the future tense active voice. It's going to make use of the fourth principal part stem. And our connector is going to be UR. Now, future, we have a UR. That's going to be our connecting vowel and consonant. And to that, we're going to be using the first and second declension adjective endings, us, a, masculine, feminine, and neuter, of course, us, a, In the perfect passive, we're also going to use the fourth principal part stem plus usaum. Now notice the only difference between this one and the one above it, future active, is the future active has the connecting vowel UR. In the perfect passive, it's just the stem plus usaum. So actually, the perfect passive participle is just simply the fourth principal part of a verb. Again, we'll look at this in more detail in a minute. And then finally, we have the future passive participle, which is the present stem plus an nd plus again the first and second declension adjective endings us, a, And I want to show you some similarities here. Notice both the present active and the future passive use the present stem, while the future active and perfect passive use the fourth principal part stem. Notice that 3 of them use the first and second declension adjective endings us, a, and only one, the present active, makes use of the third declension I stem endings. And of course, you'll want to learn the connecting vowels for each of these. Now, here's just another little chart, another way of sort of looking at or systemizing this structure here. We have, again, the present active and the passive future make use of the present stem. The active future and the perfect passive use the fourth principal part, stem. And then, of course, there's our connecting vowels, ns and t, ur, and nd. Notice that the passive perfect has no connecting vowels. Then you've got the active present using the third declension I stem endings, and then the other three forms all use the us, first and second declension adjective endings. Now, most of the time when I ask you to look at a chart for participles, this is really what it's going to look like. You're going to see the active column on the left, the passive column on the right. You've got three tenses lined out in rows: present tense, perfect tense, and future tense. Notice, again, the present active and the future passive both use the present stem. Okay? And again, notice the perfect passive and the future active use the fourth principal part, stem. And of course, you can see the two passive use us, and the future active uses the us, but only the present active uses third declension I stem endings. So notice it says there, look at that first cell there of that chart, present active. You've got the ns will be added to the end of the nominative form. The genitive and all the other forms will use nt plus third declension endings. Let's look at this in an example of ago, ageri, egi, actum. This is our paradigm verb for third conjugation verbs. So notice here we have the present stem comes from the second principal part, age, and so there's the present stem. We're going to add ns to the nominative form, but genitive and all the other forms will have an nt, so it's agens, agentis. Now, if you remember your third declension I stem endings, remember the nominative singular, it's just blank, right? We say blank is when we run through the chant. So the third declension nominative doesn't have an ending per se. It's the genitive that starts us off with the is. We'll look at a full declension here in just a minute. So agens, agentis is your present active participle. Notice there's no present passive form. There's no perfect active form. Now, I want to point out here again, this present stem, age, is not just in the present active. It's also in the passive future. There it is right there, agendus. So here we have the present stem plus the nd plus the first and second declension endings us, So it's agendus aum. Now for the other two forms, we take the fourth principal part stem, act, act. And here in the perfect passive, we just add the first and second declension adjective endings, us, so it's actus aum. Again, notice this is basically just the fourth principal part, actum, right? Now, for the future active, we're going to take that same stem, act, the fourth principal part stem, and add the ur plus us, so actorus aum. So you can distinguish the future active from the perfect passive by the ur right in the middle, because it's future, future. And again, notice the present active is agentis. It's got that nt. Just something that will maybe hopefully keep those things in mind. Now here is a full declension of the participles for ago. All right. So in the present participle active, here is fully declined. Age is the present stem. Age. In the nominative singular, you add the ns, but then we take that stem age and add an nt to all the other forms, and then you just decline it out like a regular third declension I stem ending or I stem noun. So blank, is, em, and in the ablative, in the I stem, it can be either an I or an e. In the plural, go over the two columns over there, you'll see the plural, s, eum, ibis, s, ibis. So that's your masculine and feminine forms. Remember, this is an adjective, so it's got to be able to modify a masculine noun, a feminine noun, and neuter. And neuter is just slightly different in that you have agens, agentis, agenti, and again, the neuter rule is whatever's in the nominative has to be in the accusative. So you have agens in the accusative singular, agenti, agente. And in the plural, it's ia is your ending for neuter, nominative, and accusative plural. So agentia, agentium, agentibus, agentia, agentibus. There you go. So that's your active present participles. In the perfect passive participles, again, you take the fourth principal part stem, act, and you just add usa, and decline it like every other first and second declension adjective. So in the nominative, it's actus, acti, acto, actum, acto. Remember your endings, us, e, o, o. The plural is e, orum, is, os, is. I won't run through all of those, but you know the feminine and neuter endings. Now, the future active participle is going to be basically the same thing as that perfect passive, but we're going to stick a UR at the end of the stem. So we end up with actorus, actori, I-E, actoro, I-O, actorum, actoro, A-O, and of course the plural endings that you should know at this point. So that's your future active participles. Now for the passive future or future passive participles, again, we take the present stem, age, and we add the connecting consonants, nd, plus the usa, So you end up with agendus, agendi, ie, agendo, io, etc. You can see the rest of the forms in the singular and plural. So that is a full complement of participles for the paradigm verb ago, agere. And all the other verbs will basically act the same way. Here are the paradigm verbs. Laudo, laudari. So we take the lauda and add ns in the nominative singular. And in the genitive, it's nt, and all the other forms, it's nt plus is. So laudans, laudantis. For monao, we have monens, monentis. For ago, we have agens, agentis. Now notice the audio, audiri, and kapao, kapiri. Remember your fourth conjugation and your third io conjugation can be a little funky. And one of the things that sort of is distinguishing characteristic is that in most forms there's an ie vowel combination in most of those verb forms. If you've forgotten those, go back to those chapters on conjugating conjugating fourth and third io. And look at those forms. But here we have audiens, audientis, capiens, capientis. So that's going to be true in the present active form as well as in the future passive. Notice the perfect passive forms. We have the fourth principal part, basically. Laudatus aum, monetus aum, actus aum, auditus aum, and captus aum. Future active. Almost the same thing as we just said, but we're going to add that UR in the middle there because it's future. So laudatorus aum, monitorus aum, actorus aum, auditorus aum, and captorus aum. So the future active participle is pretty easy to distinguish. You see that UR, you know that it's the future active. And really equally easy to recognize is the future passive because of the nd. We take that present stem, lauda, we add the nd plus the usa. So laudandus aum, monendus aum, agendus aum, audiendus aum, and capiendus aum. Again, notice that here's your nota bene. Notice that the fourth and third io take the ie in the present stem as usual. So you can see it both in the present active participle, but also the future passive participle. All right. Now, another special note I want you to note is that the future passive is often referred to as the gerundive, and it has a sense of obligation, necessity, or propriety. So that anytime you see that nd form, you know it's called the gerundive form. And that is to be distinguished from the gerund, which I introduced to you at the beginning of this video, which is, again, something we're going to be studying here in a few weeks. But this is the gerundive. It's an adjective gerundive. Keep that in mind. That IV will help you remember the difference between this and a gerund. All right. How do we translate participles? Well, basically, the present active is whatever the verb is, you just add an ing. All right, so love, loving. So that's how you translate the present active, loving, the loving man, right? In the perfect passive, it's verb plus an ed, or having been verbed. All right, so here it would be loved or having been loved. In the future, it's going to be you translate it as about to verb or going to verb, in this case, love. So about to love or going to love. And in the future passive, we're going to have about to be loved or deserving to be loved. That's how we translate them at face value. Now, that being said, we're going to tell you better ways of translating participles here in just a minute. We'll look at some real live examples. But one quick note, if you remember, we talked about adjectives can be used substantively, which means in place of a noun. Participles, because they're adjectives, will function the same way. Sometimes regular adjectives and participles can be used by themselves, taking the place of the noun that it should modify. So, for example, this adjective, the word good, the good die young. Good is an adjective. It's not a noun, but it's being used in place of a noun. What we're really meaning to say is good men or good people die young. And so it's just a colloquial way, a shortened way of saying it, the good die young. Here's an example. There it is, adjective being used substantively. Here's an example with a participle. The dying do not lie. The word dying here is not a noun. It's a verb. It's a verbal. It's a participle. It's describing men. The dying men or dying people do not lie. But here we use it substantively in place of a noun. The dying do not lie. Okay, now let's look at translating participles in the context of a sentence. We looked at how to translate participles on their own at sort of just at face value, but in the context of a sentence, its translation is just a little bit different. Let's take a look at the original sentence I gave you a minute ago. The walking man fell into the sea. Of course, man is our subject, fell is our verb, and we have our prepositional phrase into the sea. Walking here, of course, is our participle, and it is modifying the word man. In Latin, we would have the word ambulans. Ambulans is the participle modifying vir, man. Vir is in the nominative, singular. So ambulans is going to be the active present participle. And we're going to be using the nominative masculine singular ending. So it's ambulans. Ambulans vir cecedit in mare. Vir, again, of course, is the subject. Then we got your main verb, cecedit, active indicative, perfect third person singular, your preposition in, and your ablative here, singular, the object of the preposition mare. So here we have the active present nominative singular participle. And that translation straight out in Latin would be vir ambulans in mare cecedit. Now, here are some other examples of Latin participles in the different tenses and voices. We've got present active, vir amans amicos multos habet. The loving man has many friends. We have the perfect passive, vir amatus amicos multos habet. The loved man has many friends. And then we have the future active, vir amatorus amicos multos habet. The about to love man has many friends. Now that just sounds awkward. We would never, ever really say that in an English translation. You're going to nota bene, for more idiomatic English, you really need to translate it into the participle into a subordinate clause. So really, the about to love man would really be the man about to love, or the man who is about to love has many friends. For the future passive, the vir amandus amicos multos habet, the about to be loved man has many friends, would really be better translated. The man who is about to be loved has many friends. So just keep that in mind. We need to shift how we translate this just a bit to make a better a more fluid or more idiomatic translation in English. Now here's a couple things also to remember in translating our participles. All right. Number one, the tense of the participle is relative to the tense of the main verb. So this is a little tricky. So if there's anything a little difficult about translating participles, it's to remember this concept that a present tense participle is happening at the same time as the main verb. So it doesn't matter if the main verb is in the past tense, present tense, future, whatever tense the main verb is, the participle, if it's in the present tense, has to be happening at the same time. So for example, if your main verb is in the past tense, but your participle is in the present tense, that means your action of the participle is also happening in the past tense because it's happening at the same time as the main verb. So present tense doesn't necessarily mean present tense for the participle. It means that it's happening at the same time of the main verb, whatever time that is, whether it's present, past, or in the future. Now, if the participle is in the perfect tense, this is action that is happening before the main verb. It's prior to the action of main verb. So if the main verb is present tense, then simply translating a perfect participle in the past tense is fine. But what if the main verb is in the past tense? That means the perfect participle, that action is happening prior to that past action. And if you remember, past action is basically what we call pluperfect. So you would basically translate that as had. You would translate that participle had, whatever the verb, had come, had loved. And that's how you translate it because it's happening before the main verb. We'll look at some examples here in just a minute. And then finally, the future tense participle is action happening after the main verb. That one's pretty self-explanatory. The other thing you'll want to remember as you translate participles is often you will need to add conjunctions like although, since, when, as, after, any other appropriate conjunction that will help indicate the time or tense of the action of the participle as it relates to the time or tense of the main verb. Now, here's a couple of examples we're going to look at here. Graiki nautai videntes palaphemum tement. We're going to look at the same sentence in three forms. All we're going to do is change the tense of the main verb. The main verb here is tement. Here we have the present active third person plural form. You can see videntes is your present active participle. You know that it's present because of that nt. And so we know that's the present active. So here's the translation. The Greek sailors, Graiki nautai, the Greek sailors, videntes palaphemum, seeing Polyphemus, tement, are afraid. The Greek sailors, seeing Polyphemus, are afraid. It's kind of an awkward English translation. A better translation and understanding the relationship between the tense or time of that participle in relationship to the main verb here. As the Greek sailors see Polyphemus, they are afraid. So remember, if the participle is in the present tense, it's happening at the same time as the action of the main verb. The main verb is present tense, so therefore we're translating our present participle in the same time. And when we say as, we add that conjunction as, that helps to indicate it's happening concurrently with the main verb. As the Greek sailors see Polyphemus, they are afraid. Now let's take the exact same sentence and let's change the tense of the main verb. Here we have graiki nautai videntes palaphemum, and we have temerunt. Here we've got a perfect active main verb. So the main verb, the action of the main verb is happening in the past time. So let's see how this alters our translation. We have the Greek sailors, again, seeing Polyphemus, right? Seeing Polyphemus, it's present tense, it's happening at the same time. Seeing Polyphemus were afraid. The Greek sailors, seeing Polyphemus, were afraid. But a better translation in English, a little bit more idiomatic, here we have, when the Greek sailors saw Polyphemus, they were afraid. So this is happening concurrently with the past time. So this is also in the past. So notice we moved it from seeing Polyphemus to saw Polyphemus. Even though this is a present tense participle, a better translation would be to say saw Polyphemus because it's happening at the same time in the past. They were afraid. When the Greek sailors saw Polyphemus, they were afraid. Let's take that main verb temerunt and make it future tense. Here we have graiki nautai videntes palaphemum timebunt. Again, videntes is still present tense, so it's happening at the same time as the main verb. But now we have timebunt, which is the main verb happening in the future time period. So here we translate it, the Greek sailors seeing Polyphemus will be afraid. We really don't have much of a shift in how we're translating the present tense here. It's just happening at the same time as the future event of them being afraid in the future. The Greek sailors seeing Polyphemus will be afraid. Let's look at just a couple more examples here. Graiki nautai visa a Polyphemo tement. Now here we've changed the participle from a present active participle to a perfect passive participle. Here it's we see. This is the fourth principal part. And we see is in the nominative plural. It's modifying Graiki nautai, so the Greek sailors. Let's see how we translate this here. Again, the main verb still is in the present tense, present active, tament. So the Greek sailors, seen by Polyphemus, or having been seen by Polyphemus, are afraid. So tament is are afraid, present tense. And then the passive perfect participle is seen by, or having been seen by Polyphemus. But again, that's kind of awkward. The Greek sailors, having been seen by Polyphemus, are afraid. This might be a little bit better. Since the Greek sailors were seen by Polyphemus, they are afraid. So since the Greek sailors were seen by Polyphemus. Let's look at another example here. Let's shift that tense of that main verb from present to perfect active. So now we have the main verb as perfect tense, so it's happening in the past. And the participle is also in the past. So if you remember our rule, a passive verb is happening, a perfect verb is happening prior to the action of the main verb. And here the action of the main verb is in the past. So this has to be translated as past. But let's look at the literal translation first. The Greek sailors, having been seen by Polyphemus, were afraid. But if we're going to make it a little bit more nuanced, since the Greek sailors had been seen, there's that past action. Since the Greek sailors had been seen by Polyphemus, they were afraid. Now let's shift that main verb to the future tense. Graiki nautai wisa a Polyphemo timabunt. Again, the participle is in the perfect passive form. Timabunt is the future form. The Greek sailors, again, having been seen by Polyphemus, will be afraid. Let's look at maybe two more examples here. Pater filiam visurus casam parabat. Here we have the main verb parabat as the imperfect active. He was preparing. And then we have visurus. So if you notice that you are in the middle of that word, that tells us it's the active future participle. About to see. So pater, subject, the father, about to see filiam, the daughter, his daughter. Parabat was preparing Kasam, the house. So here's our translation. The father, about to see his daughter, was preparing the house. A little bit awkward. A little bit better translation. Since he was about to see his daughter, the father prepared the house. And one final example here. Puella in Kasam when ends, gaudabat. Here we have, again, the present active participle when he ends. You can tell by an S ending. And we have the main verb in the imperfect active, gaudabat, was rejoicing. So here we have Puella, the girl, in Kasamwinians, coming into the house, present tense, active participle, coming into the house. Gaudabat was rejoicing. The girl coming into the house was rejoicing. But a little bit better, a little bit more fluid translation might be, when she came into the house, the girl was rejoicing. Because remember, the present participle is happening at the same time as the action of the main verb, which is in the past tense. So we can change the word coming into a past form, came. When she came into the house, the girl was rejoicing. Okay, so this is participles. You're going to want to probably watch this video once or twice more, do the practice work that I've got for you, and we'll discuss this in class in the next period. Don't forget vocabulary. You will have a quiz the next period. Have a good day.